Hello everyone and welcome back to the bench. Today we're going to jump into 2026 with something completely different to what we're used to. I've always been a sucker for an interesting colour scheme, so as soon as I learned about these red and white striped Swiss 109s, I had to pick one up. I got this white boxing from Tamiya in 1/48 scale. I've never been much of a plane builder, always more of an armour guy, so I guess today we'll figure out just how transferable those skills really are. And of course, one challenge at a time isn't enough, so I also picked up some aftermarket for this build, the Eduard PE set and some res kit exhausts. The PE replaces a lot of the cockpit parts, which will be the main focus of this video in particular, and the exhausts are really fine 3D prints, which I'll get to in the next video I think. One of the guys in my local modelling club also kindly loaned me this book by Squadron Publications, which has some detailed pictures and diagrams which explain the differences between the German and Swiss versions, of which there are a couple, which I'll have to implement in this series. That's because despite being boxed and having decals for a Swiss variant, this Tamiya kit actually only includes the plastic parts of the regular German boxing. So we'll have a few changes to make ourselves. But we'll cross those bridges when we get to them. I don't want to keep everyone waiting, so let's just get right into the plastic and brass. This build began with some pretty simple cleanup of the main cockpit assembly pieces, which included the floor, the front plate and the seat alongside some other simple details. This was easily and peacefully done with a fresh hobby blade before the Eduard instructions told me that the raised rectangular plate on the cockpit floor needed to be hacked away. My words, not theirs. The heavy lifting was done with my side cutters before some cleanup was done again with the scalpel. This made way for a replacement PE part, which came with a nicely detailed riveted ring around the control stick mount and some textured plates on either side. Those plates were pretty hard to get into the right position, but with my trusty VMS superglue and some patience, I eventually got them looking square. A surprising amount of this PE sheet comes pre-painted, something I've never used before and I've only seen it a handful of times, but the colour didn't match those in the reference book, so I decided early on to just build everything I could before painting instead of bothering with some kind of back and forth process. The frame for the pilot seat was stuck in place next. I'm using Tamiya extra thin glue throughout this build. It dropped right into place and was secured with a drop of glue from the underside. There was also a cover at the back of the canopy to be dropped into place, another simple detail boost from the Eduard set. I was amazed at how much photo-etch they actually managed to cram into such a tiny cockpit, especially this neat little footrest assembly. The kit parts certainly don't look bad, and I doubt they'd ever be seen regardless, but they were snipped off the main structure to be replaced by the Eduard parts. I made a small indented line in the back of this part before getting an old piece of resin support to act as the horizontal bar replacement piece. The instructions suggested wire for that, but I didn't have any of the right size to hand, so the next best option was just reduce, reuse, recycle. This bar quickly became home for our replacement footplates, which are super nice and have nice details like a thin metal loop and lots of holes in them. There's a Swiss cheese comparison to be made here, but I'm not going to stoop to that level, just because the subject is Swiss. Once this assembly was dropped into place in the cockpit, I was able to use it to ensure our front plate was square and that it was properly aligned. I did notice an additional support or pipe behind the foot plates on one of the reference images, so I also cut a piece of wire and I glued it into place at this step also. Our attention now turned to the pilot seat, and I drilled out a slot in it to allow for the etched seatbelts. I'm not going to include the footage of me drilling it out because it's extremely blurry and it includes 2 broken drill bits, but I can assure you that it was more trouble than it was worth. I cut out the centre of the 2 holes with my knife, and then I cleaned up the rest of the part with a 1000 grit sanding sponge. I was enjoying the process of detailing up this cockpit and remaking some of the details from the reference book, so I continued that process by recreating a leather lining at the bottom of the seat. I've heard using sweet wrappers from sweets like the Ryson sweets is good for making leather textures in 1/35 scale at least, but for 1/48 plain I felt the paper texture from the masking tape would suffice. Although the parts look great, I was not enjoying how destructive the Eduard PE instructions make you be. Not only did they make me sand away the raised dials and details in the instrument panel, but I even had to cut away the whole bottom half of it. The whole time I was just telling myself if I messed up the brass part, the cockpit would be ruined. Thankfully, the replacement part only needed 2 simple bends and came printed with all of the dials and icons. The PE set also included separate cover plates with holes to show the dials through, and it gave the whole assembly an added 3D effect. I thought that it was a pretty neat solution, and it's one of the few parts in this set that I didn't end up painting over. I'm sure these details are new to nobody watching, but for someone who buys photo-etch about as often as I build planes, I found it pretty novel. There was also a couple of handles and levers to stick onto this part, including our very first Swiss alteration, a handle on the top right of the instrument panel for charging the MG-29 machine guns, which the German armaments did not need. Our assembly continues to the right and left. It was time to detail the sides of the cockpit. Both sides are not made equally though, and the left hand side received just this round piece, while the right hand side got some more, let's say, destructive attention with the Dremel. Once again, all of this is just to make way for their PE replacements. As much as possible, I opted on the side of caution, taking away too little plastic rather than going overboard. It was much easier to do the finer cleanup with my scalpel. I did as much as I could to clean this part up, but it was a pretty tricky balancing act when trying to keep some details and remove others, all while managing the curved sides and awkward angles. At the end of the day, there are PE parts to get glued on top of most of this mess, so a lot of these crimes are going to end up hidden anyway. There were a number of boxes to bend up, but they went together pretty easily, and no real glue or fuss was required until it was time to fit them in place. This process was repeated a number of times across both sides, and I matched parts to their locations from my reference book pictures wherever possible. The book was my best friend during this build and has a brief history on these Swiss planes too. 80 Bf-109E3s were delivered to the Swiss by Germany in 1939 and 40, purchased without armament or radios. This is the reason for some of the quirks and details that make the Swiss version stand out, and the ones which Tamiya helpfully just didn't include. That striking red and white striped livery that you probably noticed on the box art represents a late war Swiss scheme, and it's the one that I plan to build. If you were here from the start and saw my BRDM 2 videos, you probably know I'm a sucker for a bright and unusual colour scheme, so this one was a no-brainer for me, even if it doesn't have tracks or like a gun. Arguably one of the most noticeable changes to make a Swiss version is the KG-11 spade grip used in this version, which is noticeably different to the Luftwaffe boom type stick. As I'm sure you can see, it's a pretty particular shape with some pretty particular details, so I decided to model it up in 3D and just print it. I traced a photograph of the handle in CAD before moving to Rhino to generate the part in 3D. As with my last video, I'll upload the files to this part and the others required for a Swiss 109 at some point, and I'll leave a link in the description whenever I do that, if you want to tackle one yourself. There are a few other parts here, including some guns, some blisters and some exhausts, but I'll explain each of those when I get to them in the next episode. I printed them out, printing the spade grip in like 5 different sizes because it was hard to tell what size it should be in reality, so some trial and error was in order. I think I ended up going with the second smallest one. Either way, I simply snipped away the top of the kit part and I grafted on my new part using some more of that VMS black superglue. I think it turned out pretty neat, and it's one of the few cockpit details that'll actually be visible in the end, so I just wanted to make sure I had it right. I think it was an important change, and let me know in the comments if you agree. We're also just about finished up with our building for now, so it's time to move on to painting. If you've enjoyed the video so far, please leave me a like, and if you haven't enjoyed it, then stick around for the painting and I'll see if I can earn one by the end of that. With everything still in sub-assemblies, I hit the interior parts with a matte black primer through the airbrush, deliberately spraying beyond where I needed to, just to be safe. After that, I sprayed a coat of dark grey paint before following up with increasingly lightened versions, especially on the upper parts of the surfaces, to make for a more interesting finish. I paint with Army Painter paints, so I'm mixing these colours by eye according to references in both the book and online, but I'm going for an RLM2 or equivalent. Okay, so with the interior base coated, I squeezed out some of my lightest grey tone and I used it to pick out the details and edge highlight some of the interior elements. I'm hyper aware that this cockpit is going to be hard to see once the two halves are together, so anything I can do here to improve readability, however cartoony, is only going to help. I then used some metallic paint on the footplates to simulate some wear, and on the control stick too. My camera decided just not to focus on the painting process here, but it was pretty straightforward, and the end result looked pretty good to my eye. That is, of course, my untrained Armour modeler's eye, but I digress. This did include the teeny tiniest bit of sponge chipping on the cockpit floor, the pilot seat, and the hard edge behind the pilot seat. I'm not caking everything in a thick layer of mud this time, so hopefully I can at least be afforded a little bit of chipping here and there. It's simply in my nature. While the silver was still out, I picked out some more details on each side, again using references to guide my decision making. The oxygen regulator was one such detail, and again I'm above making a Swiss cheese joke just because it's full of holes. With a different metallic, now AK's aluminium, which is almost like a white metallic paint, I picked out the textured plates on either side of the control stick. These are pretty prime real estate in terms of visibility in the end, so they got 2 coats each to ensure good coverage. Some of the boxes and the details on each side of the cockpit were different shades of grey according to the images I could find, so I picked them out in the relative tones. This is also going to help a lot with how interesting the model looks in the end. The same pictures led me to pick out the bottom of the control stick with a pretty vibrant orange-brown tone, replicating, I believe, leather at the bottom of this part, but it's pretty hard to tell. Either way, it's a fun detail and a strong colour, so it's going in. This was all pretty straightforward detail painting, and none of these parts were really too tricky. I think coming from armour kits, I'm maybe more used to painting more finicky parts. The pioneering tools on tanks are really what comes to mind. I was pretty pleased when it came time to put out some red and yellow to pick out a couple of knobs and handles and wires inside the cockpit. Everything was still looking pretty grey, so it was nice to be able to break up the monotony. This included a red button and switch on our 3D printed handle, which should hopefully get it to attract some attention from any keen-eyed viewer. I took out some brown to base coat the fabric wrapping on that handle too, and while it was out I made sure to base coat the material in the seat also. Using a tan colour and some careful application, both of these parts also got a highlight, which helped to reinforce their shape and their materiality. With that out of the way, it was finally time for our final pieces of PE for this cockpit, which came in the form of the seatbelts. I had left these aside during painting because I knew they'd just end up making the seat harder to paint if I put them in during assembly. I painted the edges of these parts too to make sure no silver was shining through where it shouldn't be, and I tried to get them in as natural a position as possible. I'm decently happy with how they came out, and certainly any seatbelts are better than the no seatbelts included in the kit, especially if I end up posing the canopy open. With everything painted, it was nearly time to seal up the two halves and start step 3 of the instructions. For the amount of time we've spent on this model already, it seems pretty crazy that we're only that far in. Anyways, before I did that, I couldn't resist a quick enamel pin wash to accentuate all of the work we've done so far. I used a dark brown wash and I let it run along and into all of the details, making everything pop that extra bit. As always, it looked super messy when it dried, but by going back in with a brush dampened with white spirits, we can clean away any excess and get a free kind of ambient occlusion effect around any of those tiny details. I think I say this almost every video, but I really love this step and I think it makes such a massive difference to the final look of the interior. Not only does it serve to make details pop, but a more liberal application around the bottom of the cockpit also helps to suggest a certain level of grime and creates a lived-in look. I then finally sprayed all of our work so far with AK's Ultra Matte Varnish to seal it in and to unify all of the different sheens we had going on in this cockpit. The PE instrument panel stuck out particularly. Speaking of the instrument panel, I also came back with this glossy texture paste and I applied it over the dials to give the illusion that they were behind glass. I stuck in the gun sight off camera, and then it was time to stick everything else together. I did attempt to scrape away paint from the connections of parts to ensure a solid bond, and I took my time here to make sure I got everything aligned. No sense in tripping at the last hurdle. And with that, I think it's time to end this video just before I stick the two halves together. This was a video about the cockpit after all, and this way I'll be able to show off the final result in the photo slideshow on your screen sometime about now. Let me know what you guys think of these results in the comments below, and if any of you guys have experience in building planes more than Armour, then I'd especially love to know if there are any tips or tricks that I should try out next time I build one. I had a lot of fun with this cockpit, so I'm pretty certain there will be a next time. If you have any recommendations of planes I should also look at next, then put them down below too. I definitely have my eye on that recently re-released Airfix Nightfighter Defiant. In any case, thank you so much for watching, and for the support on the channel lately. Happy 26, and I'll see you in the next one.